Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Telford, and I'm the organic specialist at the province of Manitoba. And we're really gratified that all of you could join us for this training series, wherever you might be sitting today. And I'm hoping that you have lovely weather wherever that might be. So we've got over 250 people registered for this session, which to me signals that organic has come a long way since I started out in this field. So since most of you have registered for all 5 of the sessions, I'll talk a little bit more today to get you situated. And then after that, you will get to hear less of me. So there are 5 training sessions in total, 1 tomorrow and 3 next week, starting on Tuesday. And at the end of this training, if you're an agronomist, we hope that you'll feel a little bit more comfortable providing the support that organic farmers need to get going on their journey. And if you're a farmer, I hope that you will have a little bit more understanding of the science behind the practice. So the first 4 training sessions have the same format. Dr. Martinez is going to speak for an hour or so. And in the last session on Friday the 13th, I hope that is not a bad omen. That session will be a little bit different. For that, Martin is going to take the entire 75 minutes to answer your questions. So I'm hoping that as you read the course notes, listen to the recordings, or watch these sessions live, you're going to come up with some questions that are going to challenge Martin. You're going to send them to me. And I have put my email up on the screen, and I am going to collate them all and send them to him, along with any of the questions that happen to be in the chat box at the end of each day that Martin does not get to. And then he's going to take those questions away, think about them, and give you a considered response on the 13th, along with some illustrations that will help you better understand the principles behind organic. So for today, all of you will be muted throughout today's session, as well as the next 3. But please, when you think of questions, just type them in the chat box, and eventually you will get answered. It may not be today, but you will get answers. Yeah, so, and don't worry if you're gonna be called away to do something more important with running your business, because all of these sessions will be recorded and they'll be available within a day or 2. For those of you who are professional agronomists, please hang around until the very last slide. And on that slide, you will get a QR code that you can scan with your camera and get instant CEU credits for just showing up. And we have got some course notes, and here is where they live. I tried to download them this morning and it didn't quite work. So if you can't get them downloaded, we will figure out those technical problems soon, I assure you. So those course notes have been put together by Dr. Enns over the course of his career of teaching hundreds of students. And I can tell you, living in Manitoba, that I can't go anywhere without running into a student who has learned about natural systems agriculture from Martin. So he's put together these notes, and Janet Wallace from New Brunswick has done a magnificent job in editing them. And I'm sure that they will be a very useful supplement to you that will go well with the course materials that Martin will present. So just a little bit about us. Although I work for Manitoba government, I also sit on the board of an organization called the Prairie Organic Development Fund. And this organization was set up to not only support the 3 organic associations in the Prairie region, but to create programming that will support the development of organic agriculture across the Prairie. So we work on projects that are pan-prairie in scope. And this particular project, this training project, is part of a funding program called the Canadian Organic Ingredient Strategy. And this ingredient strategy is funded by CAP, the Canadian Agricultural Partnership at the federal level. And we are very grateful for our partners in matching the funds that Canada has provided. And those funders are Grain Miller, the Sask Wheat Development Commission, Nature's Path, the Bauda Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security, PHS Organics, and the FW Cobbs Company. So thank you for your valuable support for this project. So we're getting close. Martin Enns, I've known him since I came to Manitoba 11 years ago, and he has been very important in sort of coaching the evolution about my thinking about organic crop science. So Martin, just let me get his CV here. Martin received his PhD from the University of Saskatchewan in 1988, and he worked as the farm manager and research agronomist before embarking on his academic career. Since then, he has focused solely on natural systems agriculture. He founded the Glenlee Long-Term Rotation Study. So this is a research plot just south of Winnipeg, and it's now older than 30 years and Canada's oldest organic and conventional farming systems experiment. Since 2011, Martin has been working with farmers directly on participatory plant breeding to develop varieties of crops that work well in organic systems. He has worked around the world in Africa, Central America, China, North Korea, to help bring his knowledge to developing countries. So I'm going to come back at the very end to say goodbye and show you that CEU slide. But now I'm going to stop sharing and hand things over to Martin for the next hour.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. I'm assuming that you can hear me. Unless I hear otherwise, I'll assume that it's all going well. So good morning, everyone. I'm really thrilled that we're all together here. I can't believe how many people have signed up for this. So I'm assuming you can hear me. It's always odd, you know, talking into a computer screen. Okay, thanks.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, great. I appreciate that confirmation. So as Laura said, the format today is really what I've done is taken the course that I teach at both the diploma and the degree level here at the University of Manitoba and put it into these 4 modules. I'm planning on getting through each of the modules every day. But if there's some sort of leftover thoughts that will spill over to the next day, you know, that's kind of how teaching goes. But today we're going to talk about designing cropping systems with a focus on nutrient management. And then on day 5, I want to answer questions. And so I'm just going to advance the slide here and show you the format that I use in my classes. So I ask the students to pose questions after each class, and then I answer them in the following class. So this is an example from the class. So, you know, what is the best nutrient source to use? If you're using a manure, can you use a fresh manure or should you compost it? And this is the question that came from students. And so my answer was, well, from a phosphorus perspective, it really doesn't make much of a difference. Phosphorus is quite available from manure right away in the year of after application. But from the information below, which comes from the DOC trial in Switzerland, we can see, and I'm going to use my cursor here, when we compare fresh manure in the red line over the 42-year period that this study has been going, and composted manure in the green line, we can see that composted manure resulted in higher soil organic matter. And so I'm showing you this just to illustrate how I'm going to answer your questions. I like to use facts. If we don't know the answer, then we really can't give much of an answer. I always tell the students that we're entitled to our own opinions, but we're not entitled to our own facts. So let's get started with that little bit of introduction. So today we're going to talk about, the crop plant options for organic production. And these are things that you're all familiar with. What are the different crop types? Well, there's, legumes, there's cereals, there's oil seeds, there's other grains like buckwheat and other things, quinoa, there's forages, perennial and annual forages. And then there's the whole world of cover crops, which is exciting. And then the new kids on the block are, pollinator strips and a appreciation of things like shelter belt trees. And so, among those crops, there are dominant species. So wheat is an important organic crop right across the country, winter wheat or spring wheat. It's versatile. It's amenable to things like mechanical weed control. There are good varieties available. Farmers have a lot of experience growing this crop, and it can be quite profitable. But in our crop mix, there's other cereals like oats, for which there is a good market, and they are a very reliable organic crop. Fall rye, which is a unique contributor to weed control. Hemp, peas, and many other grain legumes. Flax, a very interesting crop. It's highly mycorrhizal, and that gives it some unique abilities to compete with non-mycorrhizal weeds, like mustard in this case. And so I'm showing you this just to illustrate, some of the options that are there. And of course, when we think about our crop options, we think about legumes. Legumes are critical to get the nitrogen into the system. And I always tell the students, certainly on the prairies, that the only reliable source of nitrogen for an organic system is legumes. There simply is not enough manure to supply nitrogen to large, broad acre organic grain farms. And there are legumes for pretty well every condition, for dry conditions, for wet conditions, for hot conditions, for cold conditions. And I've just alerted you to the Pivot and Grow website, which has some good resources. Some legumes are large seeded annuals, like the ones I just showed you. And then there's small seeded legumes, like sweet clover or red clover. Sweet clover tends to be grown more in the drier areas or the medium precipitation, and red clover is very popular in eastern Canada. And we even see farmers growing mixtures of the two as green manures. I've had the opportunity to see more of organic agriculture in the eastern part of the country, and I've seen some fantastic organic corn production, soybean production, sunflower production. And so these traditional row crops actually have done very well in many organic farms that I visited in Quebec and in Ontario. Here is an organic farm in Ontario that's growing corn and soybeans, but also making real good use of small grains like barley and winter wheat and spring cereals. So, this is to say that there's a lot of crop options available. And before I go and show some examples of crop rotations, I just wanted to highlight these, especially the flower strips and the shelter belts. I'm going to be talking about this next week because they're important for pest management. So I will talk about cover crops, but I'm not going to talk so much about the others today. So with all those crop species that are available to us, I wanted to share some real live on-farm crop rotations. So I want to start on the right-hand side of this graph. So the top of my screen is cut off here a little bit, but this first the column on the right is from Quebec. So this is a soybean, corn, winter wheat rotation farm, and they do a great job of growing these crops organically. They use a lot of cover crops, so peas or clover with a winter wheat. So peas would be seeded after winter wheat harvest, or clover would be relay cropped. And then I thought it was interesting to see annual ryegrass or Italian ryegrass being grown with the corn as a relay crop. So that means it's seeded partway through the corn growing season. So this rotation has worked very well for these farmers. And on the bottom here, I've made just a few comments that I've observed. And this rotation, I think they're probably getting a little bit of their nitrogen from their manure, because I don't know if there's enough nitrogen in these legumes to actually supply the entire rotation. Okay, so that's one example. So moving on to the next rotation, and this, I believe, is in Ontario. So this is this farmer has 3 years of legume grass for forage. Then here are 2 winter crops, winter canola and winter spelt, then on to soybean, and then a PO intercrop for grain. And one thing I like about this rotation, it has winter and spring seeded grains sort of mixed, and growing some winter cereals, as you probably know, is a really good idea to compete with weeds. And so I think this rotation has a lot of really good diversity that keep on top of the weeds. Next is a rotation from Prince Edward Island. This rotation starts with a red clover green manure, then spring wheat, then soybeans, then a barley pea intercrop, and then oats underseeded to red clover. One thing that stands out for me in this rotation is the diversity of legume species. So we've got red clover, we've got soybeans, and we've got peas. So 3 distinctly different legumes in the system, which is important to have. Going with the same green manure or the same legumes can cause problems in terms of diseases. Here's a rotation from Manitoba, from Western Manitoba. This is got some livestock integration. So the green manure crop is actually grazed. And so I think this is a relatively new innovation for this farmer, and it's a way of increasing the income from the green manure year. Then wheat or flax, lentil or pea, then to a 2-year hay crop, wheat or flax, oats, and then back to the green manure. This rotation, I like it. It has a high diversity and it has livestock integration. And one little nuance that I find interesting is that the 2-year alfalfa hay crop follows either the peas or the lentils. I think this is wise because these crops can cause weeds, or they can, they're not that competitive with weeds. And so if you do have weeds that build up, especially things like wild oats, the 2-year alfalfa hay crop will do some damage to those wild oats. Over here, the second last rotation is from Alberta. This is, at the bottom, you can see I've written, it's got a green manure every 3rd year. And I think this is the type of rotation that certainly for the prairie region has been really durable. So a green manure, then two crops that extract nitrogen, especially, then another green manure, then another 2 extractive crops. And you'll notice that even the extractive crops are intercropped with a legume. So lots of nitrogen in this system. Just a concern is that a little bit of it's a little bit pea heavy here. You want to be careful of growing peas in the rotation because of root rot. And then the final example here is from Saskatchewan, and this farm has roughly 2 rotations depending on different circumstances, the land base, the human resources, the location of the fields relative to the farmyard. So 3 years of alfalfa seed, hemp, flax, and then back to alfalfa. That rotation is very nice. It's got a lot of nitrogen. And then the other rotation is a green manure spring wheat going back and forth. And I wanted to illustrate this because it's okay to think about 2 different rotations on one farm, and it may depend on the soil or other circumstances. Okay, I'm trying to advance. There we go. So those are some examples of what farmers are doing. What I want to share with you here is the rotation that we've been running at the university on our mini farm. So each of the fields is 2 acres, so it's pretty small. And we ran this for about 10 years. And it's a rotation like the one from Alberta. It has a green manure, then 2 extractive crops, a green manure, and then another 2 extractive crops. And let me just share some of the things that we learned in this system. In terms of green manures, we had pea oat as one green manure, and our average biomass there was about 5,000 pounds per acre of dry matter. You're going to see why that's important a little bit later. The second green manure, we looked at chickling vetch. It didn't produce as much. We're in a relatively good rainfall area, and we can do a bit better, and maybe it's intercropping with oats that's helped. The other green manure was, so we started off with a berseem clover alfalfa mix. Weren't really too happy with it. And then we went to barley hairy vetch, and that's giving us 6,000 to 8,000 pounds per acre of biomass. And that opens up new opportunities. It fixes a lot more nitrogen. In terms of the grain yields in this system, our 6-year average wheat yield was 48 bushels of spring wheat, 29 of soybean, 22 of flax, 46 of fall rye. In this rotation, we actually split these plots and we grew either oats or fall rye. And we liked oat a bit better. It was more profitable and the yields were higher. 71 bushels was the average yield. Looking at this one yield, we had 18 bushels of oats. And that year we selected a variety that had crown rust susceptibility, and we had a bad infestation. And it really taught us to pick disease-resistant varieties. So that's a little bit from our rotation. Okay, so thanks for your attention so far. What I've done is talked about some sample rotations, and we're just getting sort of warmed up with all the ways of designing a rotation. And rotation is so much at the heart of a successful organic system. We're going to be talking about it for the next 2 weeks. But now I want to shift gears and talk about the nutrient management and how rotation plays into that. What do we know about the soil nutrient status of organic farms? Well, we conducted a survey many years ago, probably over 20 years ago now, on 14 farms in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, a bit of North Dakota. And thanks to Rob Guilford for really doing a lot of work here. And what we found is that the organic farms had a little bit more nitrogen than what we saw from soil test records on conventional farms, but lower phosphorus. And that really was the story that we encountered. I think any experienced organic farmer would say, yep, that lower phosphorus, that makes sense. And there was a similar survey in Australia, and they found the similar result with phosphorus. But and sulfur, they found a decline in sulfur. And Australian soils they're much older than Canadian soils, so they're much more weathered. They're much more risky to farm, and much more difficult. The other interesting thing is the micronutrient contents of the organically managed soils were higher than the conventional, especially for copper and zinc, and there's very good reasons for that. So let's start by talking about nitrogen. Nitrogen is the element that we need in greatest supply in farming. Phosphorus is important, as I mentioned, but nitrogen is the one that we need most of. So if we look at a simple nitrogen budget, we've got the supply of nitrogen, and We supply that mostly with legumes. We've got the nitrogen demand, and then that gives us our nitrogen balance. And you can talk to Laura Telford later, but she's leading a project to create an app to have all these budgets calculated, which I think is really exciting. When we think about the nitrogen supply, where do we, what legume systems do we need to think about? Well, I've got 3 of them listed here, and I'll go through the top 2 and get to the next one in a few slides. So annual green manures or full season green manures, or even late season cover crops, when we grow that nitrogen, and if the legumes are fixing nitrogen, if they're properly inoculated and we've got functioning nodules, then 2.5% of the above ground dry matter material we consider as biologically fixed nitrogen. So that's a nitrogen source. Then we have perennial alfalfa. Roughly from our work many years ago now, led by Dave Kellner and Kevin Vesey, we found out that if a hay stand was around for 2 years or longer, the net benefit in the rotation was about 130 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Okay, so, and then we got the grain legumes, which I'll come back to. So let's do some green manure math. The rule of thumb, as I mentioned, is that 2.5% of the above ground material is fixed nitrogen. And this comes from various scientific studies who've looked at this. So if we would say that this faba bean green manure that's being disked with this very old and worn out disc at our research station is about 4,000 pounds per acre of above ground dry matter, at 2.5% nitrogen, that means we've fixed 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And roughly, we would assume that about 60% of that nitrogen would be available the first year after, and then 40% the next year. But that is very dependent on the weather. So that's the supply side. The demand side is shown in tables like this, where, for example, if we have wheat at 14% protein, it's going to extract 1.9 pounds of nitrogen for every bushel that it produces. Or if we look at oats, a lot more nitrogen efficient, less than just under 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel of oats. We'll get to these other nutrients later. So from this, we can calculate the removal. So I get the students to do little scenarios. So you got a 30 bushel organic wheat crop at 14% protein. So that's 1.9 pounds per bushel. That means that you've extracted 57 pounds of N. Or if you have 48 bushel per acre and you're at 12% protein, you've extracted 72 pounds of nitrogen. So let's put that budget into a hypothetical rotation. So let's say we have a rotation of a green manure, then wheat, and then flax. So a nitrogen supplying crop, and then extractive crop 1 is wheat, extractive crop 2 is flax. So if we put it into that budget, and I'm hoping the slides roll along as I'm speaking. I hope there's not a delay. So if we look at that budget here in this table, we've got the crop on the left-hand side. So we've got the green manure, and that could be pea, lentil, or chickling vetch. And if we have 4,000 pounds per acre of dry matter at 2.5, we're adding 100 pounds of nitrogen. Wheat, we've extracted 57. Flax, we've extracted 30. So that gives us a balance of plus 13. So that explains to me why farmers are using these kinds of rotations, because they do have the potential to supply sufficient nitrogen to the system. Okay. Now, in our long-term study at Glenlee, we're not so smart. We didn't listen. We didn't know. We set up our rotation, one of our rotations, to have a green manure crop and then 3 extractive crops, wheat, flax, and oat. And we thought we're going to be able to grow enough nitrogen in that green manure to feed 3 crops. Okay, how did we do? Let's go to the next slide. So the next slide shows the same sort of nutrient balance table, except now we've added a third extractive crop. We've added oats at 50 bushels per acre, which has taken 48 pounds per nitrogen per acre. And so we have a deficit. We're in the hole by 35 pounds of nitrogen. Not good. And I want to come back to this table that I showed you earlier. We've, of the whatever 7 rotations that I showed you here, or 6, none of them have farmers showing 3 extractive crops after a legume phase. So the farmers were smarter than we were when we set up, than I was when I set up the Glenlea rotation. Now, the other problem with having this kind of deficit is the plants are going to go and try to find some nitrogen, or at least, or it might be the microbes that are going to try to find that nitrogen. And where do they get it from? They get it from the organic matter of the soil. And so it's like this person here taking soil and putting it into the pail and removing it for the crop. So nitrogen deficiencies will lead to organic matter declines. What can we do about this? Well, I think you already know because you've heard what the farmers do. So hypothetically, if we include a pulse crop in this phase, maybe that will work, and that's really what the farmers did. Now, when we think about putting a grain legume in, and I guess maybe we should call them grain legumes because we have soybean and we have, what we traditionally call pulses, which are, plants that you make a pulse soup out of. I think that's one of the definitions. Let's call them grain legumes. And if we look at how much nitrogen they contribute in Manitoba, this is work that was done here in Manitoba and a little bit in Saskatchewan. So it does not probably apply to more humid parts of the country, where soybean is a more popular crop. But we know that pea, lentil, faba bean, they will leave about 10 to 15 kilograms per hectare, by the way, is the same as pounds per acre pretty well. So they'll leave about 10 to 15 pounds per acre per every 1,000 kilograms per hectare of seed harvested. So basically, for every 15 bushels of peas that you thresh, you're going to leave 10 to 15 pounds of nitrogen in the soil. Chickpeas, not so much. Dry beans, not so much. Soybeans, in this work was done in Manitoba, they leave very little nitrogen for the following crop. That may be different in other parts of Canada or the other parts of the world. So if we put the pulse in this hypothetical rotation, now we've got the green manure, the wheat, the soybean, and oat. And I'm giving soybean very little nitrogen credit because I'm doing this for Manitoba. But you can see now we've really eliminated our nitrogen deficient situation, and that's a good thing. Or let's say we added peas into that rotation. We're actually adding more nitrogen now, and we now have a nitrogen surplus because the peas not only do they not require soil nitrogen or very much of it to grow, because they're fixing their own nitrogen, they also leave some nitrogen, okay? And so we're left in a surplus situation. The nice thing about this is that now this person in the field can take some soil out of the pail and put it into the organic matter. That's kind of my analogy. Surplus N is added to the soil organic matter. Now, why is this? Why am I all of a sudden talking about organic matter when I'm trying to talk about nutrient balances, and I'm just confusing you? Well, it's because the short answer is if you don't have nitrogen, you're not going to be able to fix carbon in soils. And we're very interested in building up the organic matter of our soils. It's important to make them more productive. Now, soil has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 10. That means there's about 10 parts of carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. Maybe it's 11 at some times, and maybe even up to 12, but it's pretty stable. And so if you reduce the amount of nitrogen in that soil system for a long period of time, the soil will rebalance itself by respiring off carbon. So we'll talk more about this next week, but it is what you do with your nitrogen does affect the carbon. Okay, so remember we put these grain legumes in the rotation. Let's get back and put on our agronomy hat. You know, how, you know, does that nitrogen really, does that P actually really leave some nitrogen? And this picture illustrates it very nicely. So this was wheat grown after flax, wheat grown after pea, no nitrogen fertilizer added to either of these crops in this particular year. And you can see the crop after pea is much greener at the bottom. I mean, that's an indication of more nitrogen. And so it just illustrates that these grain legumes do leave a little bit of nitrogen for the next crop. And speaking of grain legumes, my colleague, Kristen McMillan, who's presenting here at Carmen, Manitoba this summer, she's our pulse agronomist in residence here at the U of M, and she has identified circumstances where dry edible beans, phaseolus beans, can look after all of their own nitrogen requirements. I see this as a game changer. So there are some things that we know about this. The plants should be grown on neutral to slightly alkali soil, not acid soils, and that's where that happens. And so I think this is exciting because dry beans are an important organic crop. Okay, so I've talked a lot about you know, the theoretical situations of how you should be able to supply nitrogen. Let's do a reality check. What are farmers actually experiencing? Is all of this theoretical gobbledygook working on the farm? So Joanne Thiessen-Martins, Derek Lynch, and I did a survey of 41 farm fields in Manitoba, Eastern Saskatchewan, and we actually went into the fields, which means Joanne went into the fields and, you know, measured the biomass of the legume green manures on these farms. It was a lot of work. What did we learn? We learned that farms were, when they grew a full season by green manure, they were producing between, you know, 1,700 and 11,000 pounds per acre of dry matter. Remember, kilograms per hectare, it's very similar to pounds per acre. So I'm comfortable using them kind of interchangeably as I'm talking to agronomists and farmers. So some farmers had very little biomass, which is a problem. Some had a lot. The average was 4,500. The proportion of the biomass that was weeds averaged 18%. And by the way, this paper is online. You can download it. And on the column here, it's too small to read, but it gives you the percentage of weeds. You know, some farmers had 60% weeds, some had 3% weeds. And then the estimated nitrogen fixation from those legumes ranged from 0 to about 300. The average was 71. That sounds not too bad, but the median was 47. So that means half of the farmers fixed less than 47 pounds per acre of nitrogen on their full season green manures. And that is a challenge. That's not enough nitrogen for a productive system. And so I think there's still work to be done to improve green manure productivity. Some years you have droughts, you can't do anything about it. So that was our reality check. Now let's talk a little bit about late season cover crops. You'll get a kick out of this picture. I took it out of my many German, old German textbooks that I have that I learned from. And here they're putting cover crops into right after the harvest of a cereal. And that cereal looks like it has a really tall straw. And so people have been thinking about, you know, late season cover cropping for a long, long time. And so have we. And so we've done quite a bit of research on this, and this is work of Haroon Sisek, a PhD student of mine. And we are interested in, all of our work, by the way, is under organic. And what we were interested in is, you know, how late season legume growth, you know, how much did it increase the nitrogen the following spring? And the long and the short of it is that I'm just following along with my notes here, is that you need about 1,000 pounds, 1,000 pounds per acre of late growth to really get any kind of significant boost in nitrogen. And that would be about 8 to 10 inches of growth, or 20 to 25 centimeters of above ground growth of a legume would give you that. And then this second slide actually takes, Haroon looked at the increase in soil nitrogen at wheat seeding the year after the late season cover crop, and then measured how much the wheat yield increased. And basically, we didn't get any big wheat yield increases until we started producing about 1,000 pounds per acre of late season growth. So if you're only producing, 2 centimeters of late season cover crop growth, you're probably not going to get anything out of it, other than maybe some soil biological benefits. But this pea cover crop here, it's approaching 8 inches tall. This is going to start giving you some nitrogen, and so our data shows that we got about 7 bushels per acre of wheat from about 1,000 pounds per acre. But the data was kind of all over the place. But that's a rough recommendation. Okay, so remember, we're talking about this budget, and now let's talk about the demand side some more. How do we manage it? Are there ways of controlling it? Well, this picture here from Julie Grossman from the University of Minnesota shows a legume, and then when we terminate the legume, when it's dead, we start the decomposition process, and the mineralization of the nitrogen from the legume that eventually makes its way into the following crop. So the picture behind this schematic shows green manure that was disked once or twice, and that nitrogen is now starting to go through this process. Managing that process is something that's quite exciting, and it's possible. Just to put it into a schematic, when we terminate the cover crop, we get mineralization of the nitrogen from the whatever, a perennial alfalfa, a late season cover crop, a full season green manure, whatever it is. And then, this is the demand for the following crop. So what we want to do is bring these lines close together so we use that nitrogen most efficiently. So we had the opportunity to look at how different management systems affected the speed of the release of the nitrogen from various legume systems. And we looked at, for example, tillage. So here's conventional tillage, again, with our old disc and a wide blade cultivator, a blade roller, and a flail mower. All very different machines. This was Iris Weisman's master's work looking at how the blade roller released nitrogen. Did we have any nitrogen losses? It does a very nice job of killing the green manure, an annual green manure, and then allowing us not to use as much tillage. We also compared a flail mower, which is, makes you feel really good because you go through the field and you've shredded everything, but it speeds up the release of the nitrogen. So depending on what your circumstance is, you have some flexibility. So let me just show you the top of the, draw your attention to the top graph. This looks at the nitrogen uptake into wheat at stem elongation, so early in the season. And this is a thing in organic agriculture, because one of the challenges we have with biologically mediated nutrient sources, which is what we're talking about with mineralized legume nitrogen, is can we get it into that plant quickly enough? I mean, our conventional neighbors are putting on, urea and stuff, and that stuff is available right away. You get those unbelievably green crops at the end of May when, it's been cold and there shouldn't be much mineralization, but that's because the nitrogen's right there. So how do these machines affect that? Well, if we look at tillage, we did the work at Carman and Lethbridge, and this was Kristen McMillan's work. The tillage, certainly at Carman, released a lot more nitrogen, made it available. The wide blade, a little bit more. The blade roller, not so much. And the fallow, where we didn't have a green manure, well, there's just not that much nitrogen to give. And so I'm not going to say much more than just to say that it is possible to change, adjust the speed by which nitrogen is released through these different options. One option that works well in Manitoba for a full season green manure and you're growing a grain crop the next year is to use the blade roller to reduce the amount of tillage you need to do, and then just go blade roll it, the field maybe a few times, and then till it once before freeze up. And that gives us pretty good nitrogen release and also pretty good weed control. But if you want to release that nitrogen really quickly, put it through a ruminant animal. And this is a surefire way to make that nitrogen available very, very quickly. And so livestock integration has a lot of potential to speed up nutrient supply in organic systems. So very strategic use of nitrogen. We talk about urease inhibitors in conventional agriculture to slow down the release of nitrogen availability. And we can do that with our implements, as you can see, but there are times that we might want to speed up that nitrogen availability. We can use ruminant animals. And the nice thing about ruminants is their rumens are always warm, even if it's only 4 degrees outside. So lots to think about there. So now that we've got that nitrogen, we don't want to lose it. So I want to talk about catch crops. So cover crops and catch crops are different. Cover crops are grown for a whole bunch of purposes. Catch crops are grown specifically to stop nitrogen losses. And so here is an experiment that Haroon did years ago. We're looking at a grazed PO'd green manure. And then after grazing, he looked at various catch crops, barley, tillage, radish, to see how they would lock up that nitrogen and would they release it to the next crop. So people like to call radish a catch and release crop. And so, what did Haroon learn? Well, we learned that in some years in Manitoba, we could use those catch crops because, for example, if we look at this box up here, we're looking at the top 4 feet of soil, and the open circles here show the nitrate profile. This is nitrogen, nitrogen, down to 4 feet, where we did not use any catch crop. And over here, where we used either barley or oilseed radish, you can see we've locked up some of that nitrogen and we've reduced its loss potential. So for some parts of, in some years, it's important. In drier falls this next year, it didn't really make any difference. So, I would say the conclusion here is that if you're in a humid area, catch crops are important. And then, so they caught the nitrogen. Did they release it? Well, the dark bar is the no catch crop, and then oilseed radish and barley. And you can see in this year, it seemed to make quite a difference with oilseed radish being better than barley, but the no catch crop gave the highest wheat yield. And in this year, the difference was much, much smaller. So, there may be things that we could have done to this catch crop, maybe tilled it a bit more in the fall to stimulate some of that release without losing it. And those are the type of management things that we need agronomists to be thinking about. And there's all kinds of different catch crop species. These are fodder beets, which I grew on my little farm and just for fun, sugar. There's all kinds of species. How are you doing? Let's all take a stretch. I know this hour and a quarter class is intense, but we're here to learn, and I'm looking forward to reading your questions as they come in the chat, and looking forward to answering them all on next Friday. Let's talk about nutrients other than nitrogen. So remember this chart that I showed you earlier? It showed the removal of nutrients by crops. Well, we focused on nitrogen. Now I want to look at these other elements: phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and also micronutrients we need to think about. So let's revisit this hypothetical rotation which we had. We had a green manure, wheat, flax. Remember that? It had a little bit of surplus nitrogen. What's it doing in terms of P2O5, K2O, and sulfur? Well, first of all, during the green manure year, you're not adding any phosphorus, nor are you removing any phosphorus. You're just cycling that phosphorus. What's happening is the green manure plants will take up phosphorus and take it into their bodies. And when you either graze it or roll it or till it, you will decompose and you will shift those phosphorus pools. And then with these extractive crops, you're going to be removing phosphorus. So in this rotation, we've removed 31 pounds of P2O5. That should be P2O5 in the system. So we're taking phosphorus out. But I want to talk just for a moment about this recycling, because what we've observed at Glenlee in the long-term study, after the first 12 years on a rich, dark clay soil, we had a rotation of, green manure, wheat, flax, and then oats. And under the organic regime, we also had it under conventional. We actually had higher phosphorus. What's going on? It didn't make any sense. Well, my interpretation is that we had that cycling going on and the green manures were making that phosphorus more available. And this is one mechanism by which legumes do that. So here we have faba bean, soybean, and corn, and the color depicts the acidity around the roots. So the faba bean, you can see its pH, which is a measure of the acidity, is quite low, is 4, 3.5, and that's going to allow that plant to extract phosphorus. Whereas corn has a very basic rhizosphere, and so it's not going to bring up a lot of phosphorus, and soybeans kind of in between. And so what happened, our interpretation was that we boosted up that phosphorus because we were making that inorganic phosphorus available through the use of green manures. Now, the party doesn't last forever. And that's the picture of the person with the little hat. It doesn't last forever. And at the Indian Head long-term rotation, which was started in 1958, they had a rotation very much like this, green manure, 2 crops. And they found the phosphorus went up, and then after about 15 years, it went down, and it kept going down. And so you cannot rely on this system very long. All right, the other thing that we noticed even after 12 years at Glenlee is that where we were removing hay from the rotation, this rotation had 2 years of alfalfa, 2 years of extractive crops, we dropped our available phosphorus level very quickly, even after 12 years, and it's continued to drop. So the point of this is that phosphorus is something that needs attention. So let's take a look at another hypothetical rotation. So here we have, let's say we're growing alfalfa hay, 4 tons per acre. We're adding 130 pounds of nitrogen. We talked about that. If we look at the phosphorus in P2O5, we're extracting 162 pounds after a 7-year rotation, and also quite a bit of these other nutrients. And that's why returning nutrients in alfalfa hay production is just so important. Because if we look at this table again and we focus our eyes to the bottom of the table, we can see alfalfa removes 15 pounds of P2O5 for every ton. So for every 1,000-pound bale, that's 15 pounds of P2O5. And grasses extract almost as much. Now, if we grow that alfalfa for seed or we graze the alfalfa, the extraction of the phosphorus is much lower. Over the 7-year rotation, it's only 73 pounds. So it just shows the value of not removing that hay if you're not planning to replace that phosphorus anytime soon. But phosphorus is important. On the top graph, this is what Glenley looks like these days. The organic alfalfa that has not received any new phosphorus nutrients now for 31 years does not grow very well. And in this plot, we seeded alfalfa down the whole plot. And, you know, the back half looks like it hasn't even been seeded. It's not always this dramatic every year, but it shows up every year. So we want to add phosphorus. How do we do that? How do we know how much to add? How do we know how much, if we have enough phosphorus? Well, here's our rule of thumb. When the soil test, the Olson soil test phosphorus, which is used is popular on the Great Plains and in other parts of Canada, if that soil test is less than 5 ppm, we know we have a serious deficiency. And if the soil test is above 10 ppm, many agronomists would say, well, that's already deficient. But our experience is we actually grow pretty good organic crops after that. So the soil test, what I'm telling you is that the soil test works well when the phosphorus level is extremely low or above 10 ppm. Then it predicts yield reasonably well in our experience. The problem is, the problem is when the soil test phosphorus is between 5 and 10. At that point, it's harder to know what to do. And so here's a picture of Dr. Joanne Thiessen-Martens, my colleague in the soil science department. We work together a lot on a system of using the plant to tell us whether it has enough phosphorus. So we call this the green manure bioassay. And what you do is simply go to your green manure crop, and just before you're ready to work it under or roll it, take a sample, send it in for a feed analysis. And it's about the same cost as a soil test, and it gives you how much tissue phosphorus you have, and we're looking at 0.2% phosphorus as a threshold. And the reason we like to use the green manure crop is nitrogen is not limiting. This really should be the most sensitive for other nutrients. So agronomists should really be listening to this. This is a way that you could help organic farmers manage their phosphorus. We've done this a lot. Oh yeah, and there's a picture of the sickle. So here's kind of the proof. This is the work that was published here. This is the soil test phosphorus, and this is the plant tissue phosphorus. We want 0.2% phosphorus as our sort of threshold. And what you can see is that when the soil test is above 10 parts per million, all of our green manures have adequate phosphorus. When our soil test phosphorus is below 5 parts per million, pretty well all of our samples are deficient. And if we look at this area between 5 and 10, actually most of those fields are sufficient in phosphorus. But we don't want to be reckless. So this is where the green manure bioassay is the most useful. So should farmers be doing this? Well, going back to that survey of 41 fields that I talked to you about, we found that just in this table alone, 7 out of the 28 fields that were surveyed had phosphorus between 5 and 10 parts per million. So a quarter of the fields were in that range. Over half were actually below 5. So there the soil test would be fine. So yes, the answer is this green manure bioassay is useful in organic production. All right, so the final part of this lecture is what are we going to do about fertilizing phosphorus in organic farming? What are we going to do about this? What are the options? Well, manure or compost. You can bale graze. You can use organic fertilizers like bone meal, nutrients like from the circular economy. And then there's always this question of, well, what about rock phosphate? Well, rock phosphate, its utility is very much a function of the soil pH. Most of the prairie soils have high pH, and so rock phosphate, even the soft rock phosphate, doesn't give very good results. In places where the pH is much lower, rock phosphate is a better bet. So Melissa Arcand, University of Saskatchewan, Kim Schneider, University of Guelph, have done work on rock phosphate, comparing it to comparing rock phosphates. And here you can see a microscopic picture of the phosphate rock, and here it's being degraded by some kind of a, critter, bacterial activity or something else. And so there's a lot of interest in using sort of inoculants with rock phosphate, and there are people selling that thing. I mean, we have looked at some of that and have not found it to be useful on the prairies in high pH soils. So I tell my students that when they do their nutrient budgets for the prairies with high pH soils, if they include rock phosphate, they lose marks because we know it's not going to give the desired result. Where I like to start is animal manures. And this very nice chart here from the University of Minnesota shows the general nutrient content from different animal species. Now, let me say that if you are using manure on your organic farm, get the manure tested. It's worth it. These general recommendations, that's all they are. And so testing the manure is a good investment. But if we go with general recommendations, and let's say we want to add phosphorus, what do we use? We use poultry manure. Poultry manure has the highest concentration of phosphorus of any of these animals that I'm showing. Pig manure is next, and you get down to solid manure, it's quite low. Solid beef or dairy manure. Here's another chart from USDA, which shows us, these charts are all over the internet. They're very handy. Get them from a reputable source. It shows you generally how much of these nutrients are in different types of manure. So here, poultry manure with litter, 45 pounds per ton. Pelleted poultry manure, 104 pounds per ton. And then if we look at availability of the phosphorus, we can see phosphorus manure is highly available. Even dairy manure with bedding, there's 4 pounds per ton. 3 of them are available in the first season. And we have experienced this on extremely phosphorus deficient soils. We've even put compost down in the spring and gotten a phosphorus response. So remember this example that I showed you where the green manure wheat flax was deficient in phosphorus by 31 pounds per acre. I did just a quick math here. Basically, if this was a 1,000-acre farm, you would need 300 beef cattle to satisfy this nutrient requirement. Okay, so these are important sort of calculations that all that data that I just showed you allows you to do. And then the second little point, just a small little point about handling manure, and many of you will know this, is that when you stockpile or compost manure, you actually concentrate the phosphorus so that you have to spread less material per acre. And this data from Ag Canada, both Lethbridge and Brandon, kind of shows you that. Okay, so at Glenlee, we add manure to this part of the plot. We have for many, many years. We don't here, and you can see it really matters. What do you add? When you add the manure, what difference does it make? Is it all about yield? Do you get other benefits? There are really good manure studies around Canada, but I'm choosing this old one here from Indian Head, Saskatchewan. This is Ag Canada work from about 1947. It started and they ended in 1976. And this is the increase in wheat yield over the check when they added monoammonium phosphate and when they added manure, or this top line is monoammonium phosphate and manure. So clearly something about that manure is causing a little bit larger yield increase over time than just adding fertilizer. And this table explains some of that Ag Canada results. They've got 2 treatments here, which I've highlighted. So this is monoammonium phosphate at 18.9 kilograms of P per hectare. And here's barnyard manure at 19 kilograms. So they've put on very good research here. They've put on pretty well the same amount of phosphorus. So they started this study in 1947. By 1964, if you look at the phosphorus available in parts per million, it's 15 where they added the monoammonium phosphate, 25 where they added the exact same amount of phosphorus in the manure. So there's something else going on there. It's probably coming out of the inorganic phase because of better soil health. If we look by 1977, you can see the difference is even greater. So manure is a wonderful nutrient source. And if we look at sulfur, the same thing, very big difference. If we look at zinc, very big difference. So I guess to answer my question that I asked is manure does indeed provide a lot of other benefits in terms of other macronutrients and in terms of other micronutrients. And we'll talk more about this on next week, the lesson 4. But this is data from Rothamsted, the oldest research farm that I know of, started in 1843. And this is the soil carbon in Rothamsted over, about 160 years. The grain yields from these rotations are identical. But where they added mineral fertilizer to sustain their grain yields, the soil carbon did not budge. Where they added manure, the soil carbon went up quite a bit. And this is a really interesting result here. I can't help, I know I just got a few minutes left, but I can't help but share it, is that this treatment in the purple or whatever it is, a color here, they started adding farmyard manure in 1885. So about 40 years into the study, they added farmyard manure, and look at how it, had quite an immediate effect on the soil organic matter. Okay, another source of phosphorus. I'm almost done, so just take a deep breath, hang in there just for a few more minutes. Another really important source of phosphorus is bale grazing. And remember this chart where I showed you that even in ratty old brome grass bales, there's 13 pounds of P2O5 in every bale. So this bale grazing picture that I stole from the internet is adding a lot of phosphorus to this farm. And so this may be one way of moving phosphorus into the organic farm. And it should be considered whenever possible. Maybe even, offer up your land for winter grazing. I mean, there's all kinds of really exciting options. And then there are other fertilizer sources that can be used. Everything from, fish meal, which is fairly high in phosphorus, to bone meal, which is quite high, to, guano and alfalfa meal and other sources are available. And I haven't talked about potassium very much. And that's my prairie bias. The problem is the prairie soils are so rich in potassium that we even at Glenlee, we're not even close to being deficient. That is not the case in Eastern Canada. And so I'm sorry I haven't talked more about potassium, but the manure story that I talked about for phosphorus does apply to potassium. And now there are some new and exciting sources of nutrients for organic production. One of them is digestate, which comes from basically food waste or other municipal waste, which has gone through a biodigester to produce energy, with the push in renewable energy, which is going to be led by places like Lethbridge Biogas in Alberta, that's doing just a fantastic job of producing biogas from various sources. And they're also result in this nutrient-rich organic fertilizer. And then we also have now insect agriculture producing insect frass, which what we do at Glenlee now is we actually, the picture that I showed you of the manured and the unmanured plots, well, the manured plots actually get 1/3 insect frass, 1/3 digestate, and 1/3 composted beef cattle manure. This is what I call nutrients from the circular economy. And just to show you that they work, here is our low phosphorus experimental field. And we've got this nutrient phosphorus deficient alfalfa. Here's the check plot. You can see, not very impressive. Here's where we're adding fertilizer phosphorus at 30 kgs of phosphorus per hectare. And here is where we've added struvite, which may be registered for organic production sometime in the future. This comes out of municipal wastewater treatment plants. And struvite is a name that you should learn about, and look at how effective it is. Jess Nixie and I did a study looking at how much struvite phosphorus would there be if we collected it from all the sewage treatment plants in Canada, and we would have enough to fertilize twice as much organic land as we currently have in Canada with phosphorus. And then we also included nutrients from a composting toilet. So it's another human source. Okay, like I said, I'm almost done, and I'm just going to my last slide now. I'm just going into my last slide because I wanted to just thank you for your attention. We'll see you tomorrow. And I also wanted to show pictures of some of the people that have really contributed massively to the knowledge that I've shared with you. These are only some of the people that I've had the pleasure of interacting with. So with that, I'm turning it back to the host. I'll stay on the camera, I'll stay unmuted, and I think we're probably just about out of time. But back to Laura and Marla.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. That was awesome. Are you able to stop sharing your presentation?
I sure can. Let me see which, there we go, right to where it says stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm sorry we don't have time.
Well, that's what Friday is for. Like, I mean, it may seem like it's a very intense experience here, but this is what I've done in my classes for a long time. We're going to have time for discussion on Friday, so please come back next Friday. But I will take all the questions that have come into the chat and other questions that people want, and I'm going to create a document with all the answers, and I'm going to send it to you. Everybody will have a copy. Somebody just asked in the chat whether we use chaff collection for weed seed. We're going to talk about that next class. We're going to talk about that tomorrow.
Okay, so I just wanted to thank Martin once again for the fantastic presentation, and I'm sure the next 4 will be just as gripping, so please come back tomorrow and join us. Just a note that this work would not be possible without the support of the generous sponsors for Prairie Organic Development Fund. And lastly, this is the time to get your camera out and scan the QR code on the screen if you are a professional agronomist, and this gets you your continuing education credits.
And
so please.
Sorry to interrupt you, Laura, but you're not sharing your screen, or we can't see it, or I can't see it.
Oh. Sorry, I'm not too technically with it. It says that I am, so I'm not sure what to do.
While we're waiting for the QR code to come up, somebody asked me, what about the roots of legumes? That 2.5% nitrogen from the top growth, that does consider the roots. So that number is been, well researched, and it does include the roots. The roots do contribute. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's not sharing.
We could see your screen just briefly with your emails. Or your calendar. There you go.
There you go.
Perfect.
So we have captured all the questions, and I'm going to be collating them and sending them to Martin. But if you are reading the notes tonight or tomorrow, please write down any questions that you have and send them to me at laura.telford@gov.mb.ca, and I will make sure that Martin gets them. So thank you, everybody, for your attention. And we were absolutely blown away that 227 people actually tuned in. So let's keep that going for tomorrow. And I'll talk to you all then. Bye.